We can get started here. Thanks so much. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Hillary. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the New York Transit Museum. Welcome to our program, Trolleys, Trains, and Transit Museums. If you haven't been to the museum, it's a really amazing place to visit. We're located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned IND subway station. We're open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal. And now is actually a really great time to come to the museum because we have a new exhibit honoring the 120th anniversary of the subway. This is launching next week. This exhibit is going to finish the sentence, "The subway is." And it's really the first major installation at our main museum space since the pandemic, so we're really excited. The best way to stay up to date with all of our programs, everything new that's coming up, is to subscribe to our newsletter, and I'll add the link to the chat here. There we go. Now for today's program, if you'd like captions, please go either to captions at the bottom of your screen or click the three dots down there and you'll click captions and then show captions. And we're also going to leave some time, if we can, for questions at the end. So feel free to add them to the chat during the presentation and I'll be collecting them and feeding them to our presenters. So now I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. We are very pleased to have Kristen Fredrickson here today. Kristen is Manager of Visitor Experience for the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. She began her museum career at the Southeastern Railway Museum outside of Atlanta, coordinating education programs, digital media, and film productions. She also worked at the Delta Flight Museum before relocating to Pittsburgh in 2019. Now at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, Kristen facilitates events and experiences for visitors of all ages, fosters and builds partnerships within the community, and engages the museum's team of 180 volunteers. Kristen is a board member with the Heritage Rail Alliance and is fond of people movers, personal rapid transit, and other uncommon forms of transportation. Thanks for being here. And also representing the New York Transit Museum, we have Polly Desjardins. In her tenure at the museum, Polly has taken on a number of different roles, including educator, school and group manager, and is currently serving as the content manager of our education department. We're so glad to have you both here. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Polly to let us get started.
Well, thank you so much, Hillary, and I'm so happy to be here with my friend Kristen and our friends at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. But here we go. We're going to start off by telling you a bit of background, a bit of early transit history from both of our cities. So like most public transportation in the 19th century, it began with boats and horses. Right? There were many, many ferry services that operated across both the East and the Hudson rivers here in New York. But eventually, most of those routes became obsolete as they struggled to compete with all of the other transportation that was developing during this period. And of course, the building of the great East River bridges made getting between Manhattan Island, Long Island, and the mainland easier and easier over time. But New York City, which was centered on the very tip of Manhattan Island, was about to experience unprecedented growth as millions of immigrants began to move here. And of course, because of that, the need for public transportation just kept growing. It began with the French idea of an omnibus or a bus for all. Actually, it was a stagecoach for all, for a fee, of course. And it was taken up in cities like Paris and London. And in 1827, it came to New York City. Even though the fare was too much for the poorest New Yorkers, it was about 12.5 cents or a shilling, depending upon what you had in your pocket. Omnibuses proved that there was really a need and a desire for public transportation, because by the 1850s, there were over 600 licensed omnibuses carrying literally millions of passengers every year. So improvements to horsepower transit arrived with the New York and Harlem Railroad. This was the first urban railway in the country. It moved larger coaches, of course, than an omnibus, and it moved them along rails that were embedded in the streets. This, of course, made for a sort of nice, smoother, faster ride than bumping along on an omnibus. But congestion on the streets often slowed traffic to a crawl. Right. These horse car or streetcar lines were the mainstay of public transportation for several decades, and they really helped to push the boundaries of New York City northward. In fact, because of the streetcar system, the city limits moved all the way out to 42nd Street by the 1860s, which was more growth than in the previous 200 years. So that's what it did. Now, even though horse-drawn vehicles of all kinds, not just streetcars, were instrumental to how the city developed, the very last horse car line ended service in 1917, having been steadily losing customers and fares, of course, to the much faster and more efficient transit that was already winding its way through the city by 1917. So what was it like in Pittsburgh, Kristen? How did public transit begin there? I'm sure it was a sort of similar story.
Yes. Hi, Polly, and thank
Hi.
you so much for having me, Hillary. Pittsburgh's transit origins aren't too different from New York's. So the three rivers here were the major method of transporting people, materials, and goods, but traveling inland was a different story. So unlike New York, Pittsburgh is very hilly. And because of those steep hills surrounding the downtown, the flats along the river became increasingly crowded with industry and people. And there's a 1874 lithograph here on the bottom left, which shows the point of Pittsburgh and the place where the three rivers meet, the Allegheny to the north and the Monongahela to the south, and then the Ohio to the west, where they join on the left side. And downtown Pittsburgh is in the little triangle section that you see there in the center. It's a lot flatter than the surrounding area. So it took over 30 years after New York's first street railway for the first to open in Pennsylvania. And in Pittsburgh, the first one was the Citizens Passenger Railway in 1859. And, there were limits to how much a horse or a mule or a team could pull up a hill. So many of the early lines in Pittsburgh were in the flats. And by 1885, there were actually over 1,700 horses employed on the various lines throughout the city. So nearly 300 horse cars were used on the lines at this time. And mules, which, if you don't know, are a cross between a horse and a donkey, they were considered hardier and better in hot and damp climates. But Pittsburgh was mainly a horse city, not mules, until the later years. The Sarah Street horse car line on Pittsburgh's south side, which these photos show, it lasted until August of 1923, which is one of the last animal-powered railways in the United States. And a funny thing happened that people in New York might not know about when all of these railways were being built. So the streetcar lines in Pennsylvania's bigger cities were built to a track gauge of 5'2.5". 6 inches wider than standard gauge used by most other cities and the railroads. So there are all sorts of myths and theories as to why this was, but it mostly came down to each city or municipality's decision. So in Pittsburgh, the new horse railways were required to be, quote, of such a gauge as to be most convenient for the use of carriages and buggies passing over the same road. So at the peak, there were almost 3,000 miles of broad gauge track as opposed to 2,000 miles of standard gauge track. But there were 78 standard gauge operators, which was about 60%, and only 59 broad gauge companies, meaning the bigger cities decided to go with this broad gauge, and the smaller cities were the ones building the standard gauge. So the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum today operates a broad gauge railway. And these streets, they were getting pretty busy pretty quickly. How did New York City deal with all the congestion, Polly?
Yeah, I mean, on the next slide, we can see so much congestion, right? But New York figured that they had a solution, And their solution was to go above the streets on elevated structures. And so that's what they did. Land, of course, was at a premium. The city was confined on a long, skinny island, and neighborhoods in lower Manhattan, where the settlement had been growing slowly for a couple hundred years, became literally the most densely populated of any city in the world. So without providing faster, more efficient transportation, growth was going to be stagnant, right? So investment was made in elevated train lines that finally saw sort of rapid transit 19th century style begin to really change New York City. In Manhattan, 4 lines connected South Ferry at the very tip of the island to Harlem and the Bronx, and eventually they went across the 59th Street Bridge and into Queens. Brooklyn installed elevated train lines beginning in 1885 that connected with the Brooklyn Bridge, of course. And you know, those lines really helped to populate communities throughout the area, and of course made the journey in and out of the city so much easier. The Manhattan elevateds and many elevated lines in the outer boroughs were torn down between the 1930s and the 1950s. Many were replaced with subway lines, of course, but about 40% of our system is still above ground today. So we still have elevated lines. On the left side of the screen are the tracks of the 3rd Avenue elevated, riding over the Bowery, which is a pretty notorious street in lower Manhattan. And as you can see, it's a steam locomotive. So this was before the lines were converted to electricity, which happened all in by 1903. And then the image on the right side of the screen is one of the really lovely ornate elevated stations. This one is also on 6th Avenue. Did you have elevated lines in Pittsburgh, Kristen?
Well, Polly, we didn't really have elevated lines here in Pittsburgh. But speaking of elevation, we did have inclines in Pittsburgh.
Love
So,
them.
these are also known as funicular railways, and the first of Pittsburgh inclines opened in 1870, and eventually there were at least 17 of these. It depends on what source you look at, because they were built at all different times, but at least 17 of these around the city. And I talked about Pittsburgh's geographic challenges. The inclines were the first attempt to use mechanical creativity to conquer the hills. And the way this worked was each of the 2 incline cars is connected to the opposite end of a cable, which runs through a system of pulleys, and the cars are counterbalanced. So while one car is pulled upwards, the other car descends. Yes. So this started connecting the neighborhoods up on the hills with downtown. And many inclines connected with horse car routes, and eventually electric railways down at the bottom, so people could continue their trip into the city for whatever they were doing that day. And most of these inclines did carry passengers. Some had separate parallel freight inclines or a freight compartment underneath the passenger area. And this was also a way for people to get away from the pollution and smog that settled downtown. And Pittsburgh was a big steel town. And there are photos during the height of that industrial era when it looks like nighttime in the middle of the day. So these are photos that you're seeing of the Duquesne Incline, which is one of the 2 operating inclines in Pittsburgh today. The other is the Monongahela. The Duquesne Incline uses its original Brill-built vehicles from the 1870s, which have to be among the oldest continuously operating transit vehicles in the world, if not the oldest. Yeah, those elevated lines in New York, Polly, were those like spooking all the horses on the streets?
Well, it's funny that you asked that. I mean, I just want to say that inclines are like my favorite thing. I wish we had one somewhere in New York because I just want to ride one. But yes, poor beasts, horses spooked by many things, including the elevated trains. But starting in the 1890s, horse car lines were replaced with electric trolleys. And trolleys got their power from overhead wires right through a trolley pole. And those were mostly outside of the city, outside of Manhattan. And then streetcars, of course, which got their power from a conduit in the street underneath the vehicle, and those were in Manhattan. No trolleys in Manhattan because after the Great Blizzard of 1888, they buried all their infrastructure and they did not want overhead power lines. So hence a conduit. Now, trolleys and streetcar lines proliferated, again, providing an even smoother ride than the horse cars, though not necessarily faster, since, again, there was a lot of congestion on the streets. They could certainly carry more riders than omnibuses and horse cars, and they designed both summer and winter models that allowed for sort of more comfortable travel throughout the year. In the image on the left of the screen, that's a summer vehicle. You can see it has no walls there. Trolleys and streetcars weren't without their problems, of course. In fact, the image on the left side of the screen shows you a trolley with a passenger scooper, people scooper, if you like, on the front. And this was a device that was, meant to prevent serious accidents. It was meant to prevent, it was meant to scoop a body up if it happened to fall on the tracks. Terrifying, I know. And nevertheless, even with the people scoopers, by 1908, traction accidents were commonplace on the streets of New York, especially accidents involving boarding and alighting streetcars and trolleys. Now, I'm not an expert on the demise in New York City of these vehicles, but they were all gone by the 1950s, and that was largely to do with the rise of the automobile and the motor bus that had, major political support here in New York. Was it a similar situation in Pittsburgh, Kristen? Did your streetcars go away too?
The streetcar story is very similar in Pittsburgh, at least in the beginning. So after a brief period in Pittsburgh with a few cable railways and some experimenting with the conduit current collection, the first real electric lines opened in 1890. And soon, many horse car line conversions followed. And one of the last horse car lines to be electrified actually crossed a covered bridge that was made of wood. And so there were concerns there that the sparking from the trolley might cause a fire. So they held off on that one for a while. But new electric lines were being built, new companies sprang up, and these were eventually consolidated under Pittsburgh Railways Company. And there were about 400 miles of track and almost 1,300 passenger cars. And around this time, lines out to the nearby cities were being built. And these were called interurbans. And these allowed people from rural areas to take the trolley into Pittsburgh. So everybody was getting more connected. The peak year in terms of passengers came in 1923 with almost 280 million. But by 1933, traffic fell 50%. And the transit industry was in trouble, which is familiar to many cities. Pittsburgh joined in with the Electric Railways President's Conference Committee to develop a modern streetcar that could compete with the automobile. And this streamlined car that was developed became known as the PCC car. So the PCC, of course, stands for President's Conference Committee. And by the mid to late 1930s, these cars were purchased and placed into service on transit systems across the country. You can see an example of one in the photo on the top left. Pittsburgh eventually had 666 of this type of streetcar, which was the third largest fleet in North America after Toronto and Chicago.
If I'm not wrong, Kristen, New York had PCC cars too, right? I think we did an order and people loved them.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
then I think the mayor prevented them from getting any more. Sorry.
Oh, that's a good history there. And then after World War II, cities began to rapidly convert their streetcar lines into bus routes, but Pittsburgh Railways Company did not have the money to invest in this large-scale conversion. So they remained faithful to rail transit for a pretty long time. But, as routes began to lose money and maintaining all of the track became too much to handle, some of the tracks were just paved over, lines were abandoned. But Polly, unlike New York, Pittsburgh hung on to its streetcars. So they were threatened again in the 1960s and 70s. This is one of my favorite stories when Westinghouse Electric in Pittsburgh proposed a transit expressway, commonly known as SkyBus, as the solution to all the city's transit problems. And this rubber-tired automated people mover would take over much of the streetcar right-of-way in the South Hills of Pittsburgh, where the remaining trolley routes would become busways. And a demonstrator was built in a park south of Pittsburgh. And as you can see by these photos, it attracted many riders who wanted to see this new technology. And, after drawn out political squabbles, the city eventually moved forward with a light rail transit proposal, which honestly makes a whole lot of sense because they already had streetcars on the planned route of SkyBus. So very logical. And I always like to point out here that there are not many new technologies that the streetcar defeated over the years. Automobiles, buses, trackless trolleys, but the trolley did emerge victorious in the fight against SkyBus. And so while SkyBus did not work out in Pittsburgh as a transit system, the technology developed for this project is thriving in airports around the world, including Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Frankfurt, Rome. You've probably ridden something like this, either around the country or around the world. So SkyBus, you can see, was on these elevated tracks, but I know the majority of New York City transit is underground, Polly. At what point did New York City decide to go underground with their transportation?
I'm trying to get past SkyBus, Kristen. SkyBus is so awesome. It kind of reminds me of the very, very short-lived monorail that they put up in the Bronx that lasted like a day or something before it
Yeah,
collapsed.
a lot of
I have to look
people
into it.
a lot of people in Pittsburgh refer to it as the monorail, but it was not
Yeah,
technically a
not
monorail.
technically a monorail, but it looks awesome. I like that it actually looks like a bus. So yes, subway construction. Subway construction got underway in New York in March of 1900. We were about 7th in the world to start building an underground system. Of course, London came first. The first line opened to the public on October the 27th, 1904. So as Hillary said, we are about to celebrate the 120th anniversary. Though the system was owned by the city, private companies operated the first subway lines. And in the 1930s, the first city-operated subway opened. It was called the Independent. The whole system was municipally run beginning in the 1940s. And then the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, that's in charge today, was created in 1968. And that was to run the subways, most of the bus lines, and the two busiest commuter railroads in the country, Metro North Railroad and Long Island Railroad, as well as the Bridge and Tunnel Authority. So quite an enormous mandate there. So the complexity of such a vast system built over many years means that it can be difficult to understand and navigate. But once you can recognize sort of certain distinguishing elements, it's sort of really possible to demystify the subway system. And I'm going to tell you more about how we do that with guests on one of our signature walking tours in just a little later in the presentation. Of course, subway car design progressed from the very first composite cars, which were made from wood and metal, to the newest, shiniest, stainless steel clad, technology-filled, open gangway trains of today, which you can see right there on the right side of your screen. And if you're able to visit the museum, on the left side of the screen, you are seeing our platform filled with our vintage fleet of cars dating from 1904 to the 1970s. They show the changing aesthetics and changing technology over time. And I just wanted to give you a taste of both the oldest and the newest right there on the screen. But Kristen, will you bring us up to date with what's happening in your neck of the woods? Because I don't know.
Well, sure. So I guess I better bring us up to present day.
Present day.
Yeah, Pittsburgh had a unique era in the 1970s and 80s where you would find those PCC cars in different colors and paint schemes on the streets, and many of them advertised local or national products and businesses. And here are just a few of my favorite examples. One of the classic ones is in the top left. That's the Mod Desire. And next to it on the top right, we have the Triple Treat, which advertised a ride on the Monongahela Incline, a ride on the streetcar, and a ride on the Gateway Clipper boat for a single price. And with all the modifications to this car, you can see there on top, it's got some stuff built up there. It was actually too tall to fit in the transit tunnel that takes the streetcars through the Mount Washington to the routes in the South Hills. So it could only travel on a particular route after those modifications. And then in the bottom left, you can see the camouflage. This is the Army trolley, or can you see it? And in fact, this paint job was too effective because the Army car got into more accidents with automobiles than any other streetcar because the motorist just didn't see it. And in the bottom right, we have the terrible trolley, number 1713, which was painted in Pittsburgh Steelers colors and named after the yellow so-called terrible towel that Steelers fans wave at football games. And we actually recently acquired this car and are going to be returning it to this paint scheme very soon as part of its restoration. And the PCC cars ran until about 1999, September of 1999, when they were officially retired, though the new light rail vehicles had started arriving in the 1980s when the rails were removed from city streets and Pittsburgh had a downtown subway that opened. And as such, Pittsburgh is one of the few systems in the US that never actually abandoned streetcars, so it is considered a legacy system. Today, Pittsburgh's light rail system includes about 26 miles of track and still continues to use that 5'2.5" Pennsylvania broad gauge. So we're in Pittsburgh. Where exactly is the New York Transit Museum located, Polly?
Great question. Great question. The Transit Museum is located in downtown Brooklyn, an area that we've always been lucky enough to have an abundance of public transportation. We are housed in a 1936 decommissioned IND, independent subway station, that closed for passenger service after only 10 years back in 1946. And actually, I think this is one of the things that makes the museum a really special place, and a truly authentic experience, right? Because we're in a real museum. As a working station, we've got some of the same limitations as the rest of the system. For example, we don't have any air conditioning on the platform level, which makes it pretty hot in the summer and cold in the winter, but it allows us to display our train cars and other wonderful objects in context, which is great. The museum came about, like many others in the country, during a really special year. In 1976, as America was celebrating the bicentennial, preservation-minded individuals at the New York Transit Authority thought that it would be a great idea to have an exhibition about the history of the subway system as part of the celebrations in the city. It was called the New York City Transit Exhibition. Okay, there were efforts within the MTA to preserve old equipment, and that meant sweet talking everyone from powerful transit bigwigs to rank and file employees at rail yards, right, to prevent the junking of old cars and to figure out how to store them. Plans were made to not only put the train cars on display, but also to allow tour groups to ride the old cars on nostalgia rides, which of course continue to this day. So the exhibition was supposed to be a 3-month run from July the 4th, 1976 until Labor Day of that summer. And it had the best tagline for an exhibition I think I've ever heard. I may be biased, but catch all the trains you missed. I mean, it's so brilliant. I wish it was still painted somewhere today. And really, truthfully, the exhibition was such a smashing success that it remained open past its original closure date by almost 50 years. In December of 1988, the New York City Transit Exhibition officially became the New York Transit Museum. Often people want to throw city in there, but we're the New York Transit Museum. And the name change sort of acknowledged the fact that we established a formal collection policy. And actually, I'm sitting in one of our 2 archives, and some of our holdings, just to give you a sort of idea of what we collect, we have over 5,400 linear feet of archival material consisting of maps, documents, photographs, ephemera, audio-visual materials, and more. This includes over 500,000 photographic items alone. I know. There's over 35,000 engineering drawings, close to 15,000 objects, and of course, our famous fleet of vintage subway cars and our buses. So we have a lot. But tell us more about how your museum began, Kristen. Was it established by transit authority, transit workers like ours?
So it was founded by people with a passion for transit, yes. So until 1953, Pittsburgh Railways operated 2 interurbans south of the city, and one of those went to Washington, PA. And you always have to say Washington, PA, so as not to be confused with Washington, D.C.
Right.
And you can see on the map on the far left, Pittsburgh is at the top there, and Washington is at the bottom left. And our museum was founded by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And Pittsburgh Railways, the transit system, was very supportive of the club and worked with them to move the first 3 cars, and more after that, but the first 3 cars moved out here under their own power in 1954 across the abandoned track just before everything was basically torn up. So in the picture on this kind of center there on the top is the first 3 cars on their way to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. The line had been abandoned about 6 months at that point. So the museum opened to the public in 1963, almost a decade later, and we've grown and expanded since then. Today, visitors can take a 4-mile round-trip ride and browse a collection of about 53 streetcars and electric railway vehicles. A couple dozen or so of these run. And so every day we're open, which is right now Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays from 10 to 4, at least 2 streetcars will be running. So you have a chance to ride 2 different ones. And when you come back on a different day, the chances are that a different set of cars will be running. And in the past year, we've had some big changes around here, which are very exciting. So if anybody watching tonight visited the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum a long time ago, it's a whole new experience now. Our new Welcome and Education Center opened in November of 2023, so not quite a year ago. We've got all new interactive exhibits, a trolley simulator, which was filmed on our streetcar line, a street paved with 33,000 bricks, which you can see there in the top right, and so much more. You can see a lot of things from our archives on display there in the top left. That's our interactive exhibit room. And we have about 180 volunteers at the museum. So right in the middle, at the bottom photo, you can see our longest serving volunteer, His name is Art. He's turning 105 very soon.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good for you, Art.
I know. So in addition to a trolley display building we have, which holds 22, 23 streetcars and our new exhibits, we also offer a lot of fun programs and special events. So if you like tonight's format, come check out our virtual Trolleyology series, which is where we typically talk about Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories about our collection and tales of the trolley era. And some more popular programs include Operator for an Hour. There's a photo of that on the bottom left, a gentleman being instructed on how to operate a streetcar. We also provide a park and ride service to the Washington County Fair. And this year we actually ran 9 streetcars at once on one day of the fair, which was very exciting. We're like a real transit system then. So among our other programs, we have a street fair, which you can see a fire dancer there on the picture on the right with one of our trolleys in the background. We do a vintage communications weekend. We celebrate National Dog Day and let all the pups come ride the streetcars. And of course, we do lots of scouts and summer camps as well. You can learn all about this stuff on patrolley.org, which I'll put in the chat at some point. But we also work with our local transit system in Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh Regional Transit, for tours and special trips. So in the near future, we hope to have probably next spring some tours with them as well. So stay tuned. We also celebrate a lot of seasonal events at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, including the ones coming up soon: Pumpkin Patch Trolley, Tricker Trolley, and Santa Trolley. So you can see some photos from those here too. We've got tickets on sale for these now. So yeah, visit patrolley.org if you want to learn more about the museum, how you can visit, become a volunteer or a member. And, you know, I know the Transit Museum must see a lot of visitors and have a lot of programs too, right, Polly? What are some of your favorites?
I'll tell you all about them, but I just want to say that I'm coming to your museum because
Oh,
you have
yeah.
so much going on, and I want to drive a trolley. I mean, I need somebody to teach me. I can't drive a car, but I
Oh,
bet you I could drive a trolley.
yeah,
I
it's
bet
not too
you.
hard. Yeah,
It,
the tracks show you where to go. You don't have to steer or
Exactly,
anything.
right? No steering. It's just going fast and going slow. I can't.
Yeah,
I'm definitely going to come though. Thank
great.
you for letting us know. So I'm going to give you a general roundup of what the New York Transit Museum has on offer, some of which is represented in the images on the screen. So we have free community events, big sort of all-day events like the one on the screen. The top left-hand corner, that's Bus Festival, which we just celebrated in September. We do walking tours all over the city. We go to the Gowanus area in Brooklyn. We go to the old City Hall station that you're seeing there on the bottom right of your screen, one of the most beautiful stations, if not the most beautiful subway station in the city. We do a Second Avenue art and walking tour. There's a tour of Grand Central Terminal, and Grand Central Madison. We have in-person programs at the museum. They're represented there on the bottom left of the screen. So we have art workshops and lectures and book launches and book talks and panel discussions with experts. And we have museum tours every weekend. Public tours are free every Saturday. And of course, just like this one, we have lots of virtual programs. We do in-depth deep dives into sort of various transit related topics. We bring in experts. We use museum staff for all of those. So lots and lots going on, but I want to focus in just for a minute on one of our signature walking tours that I mentioned a little earlier. It's called Underground NYC Subway 101. If I could recommend any of our tours to someone who wasn't so familiar with New York subway, this would be the tour I would suggest. So with the city as our backdrop and transit as our focus, obviously, we are able to bring guests through time and space on a journey to sort of demystify the subway. That's what we're trying to do. So the subway system isn't just a way to get around and move people. It's a massive public space providing opportunities to engage people through art, design, and of course, its own storied history. Underground NYC takes guests through 3 subway stations in Manhattan. We travel over the original line called the IRT, and then we continue onto the lines of the subsequent companies, the BMT and the IND, until we arrive back in Brooklyn and we make a last stop at the Transit Museum. Throughout, we sort of point out elements of design and engineering that illustrate what time period the station was built and by which of the 3 predecessor companies it belonged to. In all the stations we visit, we not only point out pieces of past infrastructure, we see how the past has been incorporated into the present and future of the stations through artworks installed by MTA Arts and Design. And, you know, that's the branch of the MTA that does all that, that puts all the art into the stations. The top right-hand image is an artwork at 14th Street, 8th Avenue subway station by an artist called Tom Ottenes. It's called Life Underground, one of my favorites. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, sorry, one more thing to say. So as we travel between those stations, I know, always something to forget, we travel on board the latest car fleets, and we're able to sort of talk about train design and how it's changed over time, pointing out all the special features and all the ways that number line trains and letter line trains are different to one another. And what we really hope is that the tour gives people some good background information and context for why the system is the way it is, why it looks the way it does, and to convey a sort of renewed appreciation for the engineering marvel that moves close to 4 million people each and every day.
That's so fascinating.
It is.
The picture in the center at the top, like, oh my gosh, I love stuff like that. You know, like, why does it look like this? And
why does it look like that?
What used to be here?
Exactly. And that's what we hope that the tour does. Yeah. And this year, as Hilary said, we're going to really be focusing on the 100th and 20th anniversary of the subway, of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, the IRT, which opened the first subway line in, again, 1904. So we have our brand new exhibition opening in our Brooklyn space called The Subway Is. And there are some pretty special subway focused events happening around the exhibition, including a nostalgia ride on Subway Day itself, October the 27th. We're going to take our vintage low V cars, tracing some of the original IRT route. It's going to start at the old ferry station. It's going to travel north on the west side on the 123 line towards the Bronx, and then it's going to go down the east side, down the Lexington Avenue line, and it's going to take a loop through the old City Hall station, which you're seeing on the left side of the screen, ending at Brooklyn Bridge City Hall station. So pretty special. And then just to mention that on top of all of this, the next big celebration for the New York Transit Museum will be our 50th anniversary in 2026, which will be a wonderful time to come and visit. So we just have so much going on, and I know that Hilary is going to fill us in on all the rest of the programs that the Transit Museum is going to put on this fall. But I just want to say thanks so much to you, Kristen. You've really whet my appetite. I must come to Pittsburgh, come to see you, but really I'm coming to drive a trolley.
Likewise, I have visited your museum many times, and there's always something new and exciting to look at. And not to mention the little annex in Grand Central Terminal where you can go buy lots of gifts. So yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for connecting these great histories and telling these different transit stories. I love how they're both so kind of unique and specific, and yet there's lots of these connecting threads too that kind of bring us all together. We definitely have some time for some questions. So if you had some burning questions as they were chatting, please throw your questions in the chat, and I'll be asking them of our speakers. There was one that was just mentioned that I thought was a great one that was saying, speaking of Philadelphia, and I know you're the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, not just Pittsburgh, how much do you cover the Philly area history? And kind of what's, I know a lot of your focus of your talk tonight has been around Pittsburgh, but I know you also, deal with the whole state and even beyond.
Yes, I wish I could have talked more about Philadelphia tonight because that would have probably doubled the length of my part of the presentation. So that didn't work. But yes, at our museum, we do cover Pennsylvania transit. So our collection is pretty evenly split between Philadelphia streetcars and Pittsburgh streetcars. We also have some streetcars from surrounding areas like West Virginia and Ohio. But the Philadelphia streetcars are great because they're also broad gauge, so they can run easily on our tracks here. We also have a streetcar from New Orleans. Speaking of gauge, New Orleans and Cincinnati also use the 5 foot 2.5 inch broad gauge. So we have the streetcar named Desire from advertisements and Life magazine here at the museum as well. So yeah, great question. Our museum exhibits focus on a mixture of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So if you come here, you'll see maps on our wall of both cities and a nice split between the two.
Fantastic. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. It's easier than having folks unmute, unfortunately. Great. I know that we have all these artifacts and ephemera and, 2 buildings worth of materials. And I know your focus is mostly on the vehicles, but do you have like a larger collections that you do for the Pennsylvania area that includes, I know you mentioned some maps and other things. Do you have a big collections as well?
We do. Yeah, we have a whole 66,000 square foot building that is pretty much dedicated to, more like photos, documents. I don't know if I have like the count like Polly does for Transit Museum, but yeah, we do have a lot of that too, from, blueprints to artifacts and, uniforms and all sorts of things like that. So we're always looking for help with that as well, because we are in the process of cataloging everything. So if anybody out there is interested, let us know.
Is your curatorial team mostly volunteer as well?
So we've got a small staff of about 10, and none of them are focused on archives right now. So the archives is mainly with our volunteers, and we do have an archives manager who is a volunteer.
That's very impressive.
Yeah.
And I was thinking actually even, Polly, about our collections. I know we have so many trains and buses. Do we even know how many we have? I know only a few trains fit on our platform at any given time. And of course, we can't really bring our buses down to the platform. So we have Bus Fest and things like that. But do you know what numbers we have?
That's a great and really tricky question, Hillary. I didn't prep for that one. I don't actually know how many vintage cars reside in the collection. I think there are something like 21 that we keep in the museum on display. But we have some of our cars reside on MTA property in various parts of the city. Buses reside in depots, various depots across the city. So everything, lives on MTA property if it's not actually on display in the museum. But great question. I'm not actually sure how many cars.
We'll have to get a count at some point.
Yes. Now.
There was a specific question about, let me see if I can find it again, that was looking at why the PCCs and 1950s buses look so similar. Was it the fashion of the time or something else specific in how they operate?
From my understanding, one of the biggest pieces of competition to streetcars, were buses. And so that was intentional that they kind of looked like that. That was the modern design, and so was streamlining in general. And they also wanted to design them to be mass produced, because a lot of cities built their own streetcars, or it was hard to get parts if they weren't mass produced. So there were thousands of PCCs across the United States. So something that was mass produced, something that looked cool, something that was comfortable, something that you could get passengers on and off of quickly, and lower the dwell time, get them moving. So yeah, that was all factored in to the design.
I mean, it's fascinating because I've never seen a PCC streetcar. I wish I had. I wish I'd been on one, so I clearly have to come. But we just had Bus Festival, and some of our vehicles, you know, from the 50s have that beautiful sense, that sort of rounded aesthetic. They're just so pleasing to the eye, and inside really comfortable. I was sort of struck, I'm always struck by our vintage bus fleet, that it's so communal. The way that the seats are set up is so communal. It's like you're meant to sit on those buses and have a chat with somebody. You're not meant to just ride and look out of the window. But I wish I could had a good comparison. I wish I knew more about what a PCC streetcar looked like, because I bet our buses look just like them. And
also,
I mean, again, like you, Kristen, I think they were really popular. And I think they were really popular with passengers. And so maybe in New York anyway, the buses were trying to mimic those streetcars because they knew how popular they were with the riding public.
and from the operations side, at least all the PCCs at our museum are foot controlled, so they're more like buses in that way as well. Whereas the older streetcars you're controlling with your hands.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's a lot of commentary in the chat as you were talking, and apparently Brooklyn did get a huge order of PCCs and possibly the first. So
yeah, no, they did, but then the mayor prevented the BMT from increasing that order, and instead went to motor buses instead of streetcars.
Yeah, I wonder if there's any still in our collection. Probably not. There was a question about whether the SkyBus was in the Trolley Museum collection. Yeah. We heard that, unfortunately, no, but that'd be fun to see.
It is not, but there is still one that exists. It's like, you know, right there along the side of, I can't remember the name of the road, but it's in West Mifflin, PA, not too far from here, at the Alstom facility. So Alstom is basically the descendant of Westinghouse that builds people movers. So at their facility near Pittsburgh, you can still go see one. It's been restored probably 12 years ago or so, and it looks great. It looks just like it did back in the day. Unfortunately, it doesn't run though.
I just read in the chat that the original Brooklyn PCC car is up at Shoreline Trolley Museum. Thank you, Paul, for letting us know that. So clearly I need to go up to Shoreline too. I've got a lot of traveling to do.
I'm very impressed with the transit knowledge of our audience this evening.
Yes,
absolutely.
Always.
You know, it's interesting that our system, you know, a lot of the programs that we run at the Transit Museum do require a lot of coordination with our kind of MTA compatriots, especially when we're taking nostalgia rides out into the system. Do you work a lot with the kind of transit in Pennsylvania, or is it mostly kind of separate because the tracks aren't really active anymore?
Sorry, I missed part of your question because I was distracted reading all the interesting comments in the chat. But you're asking if we work with local transit systems?
Yeah.
Yeah, so with ours nearby here, Pittsburgh Regional Transit, we just had an event called the West Penn Trolley Meet, and we had a group of trolley fans from around the world, and they gave us like a very special tour of the system, which was really neat. We got to go on like non-revenue tracks, and we have a great relationship with them, because obviously, you know, a lot of cars through the years have come to the museum from the Transit Authority. And one of our volunteers who's here, Larissa, is actually writing a whole history of the museum that's kind of been coming out in installments over the past, oh, the lights just went out, over the past year or so, because this is our 70th anniversary. So so yeah, you can learn more about our relationships with the different transit systems in Pennsylvania through those blogs. But same with Philadelphia. We have a lot of connections there, and we're really lucky to have good relationships with the two big cities transit systems in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, for sure. We couldn't do what we do without our colleagues at the MTA, for absolute certain.
Yeah, it's a really amazing kind of partnership. Definitely. So I think that kind of wraps up our questions. Thank you all so much for asking such fantastic questions, and thank you, Kristen and Polly, for such a fascinating presentation and sharing this great history and all these amazing programs. I definitely feel like I need to make another trip to Pittsburgh, such a great city, and try to drive the trolley. It's one thing, unfortunately, we don't offer at the Transit Museum, but you can drive the play buses in the in the museum.
Thank you so much for having me, Hillary.
No, this was fantastic. So I just wanted to kind of give you a few updates on things that are coming up. Again, we'd love to have you all come and see the Transit Museum if you're in town. If you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. I have some links I'm going to throw into the chat that has details about how you can get more involved. And of course, this is actually a really great time to get connected with the Transit Museum because we have so much great programming happening. As we mentioned, the new exhibit, The Subway Is, opens Thursday, September 26th, so that's just next week. That's going to be really exciting. The Underground NYC Subway 101 tour that Polly was mentioning happens about once a month. The next one's going to be October 17th. There's still tickets. Such a great way to learn about the history and genesis of the subway system. And our 120th Subway Anniversary Nostalgia Rides are happening. We have ones on October 27th, which is kind of Subway Day, the birthday of the subway, and November 16th. They are starting to sell out. So if you really want to come, you got to grab your tickets soon and can take a ride on those LVs. It also includes access to the old South Ferry Station, which is decommissioned, and we're only getting kind of special access for the rides. Also in October, we have a few in-person programs that are really great. Raleigh Diadamo, who helped design the iconic Unimark map, will be at the museum in conversation with map scholar Peter Lloyd. That's going to be on October 10th. And then on October 23rd, we're going to be celebrating the launch of a book about the building of the 2nd Avenue Subway. It's called 2nd Avenue Subway, Building New York City's Most Famous Thing Never Built. So we hope to see you at one or more of these programs, and again online with our next virtual program. But until then, have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Kristen.
Bye, Kristen. Bye, Polly. Thanks so much.
Bye.